friends, welcome to Quarantine Quilting. Today we're going to learn how to chain stitch. This is the process you use to sew together your squares, which you then turn into your quilt blocks. So before we get in front of our machine, I wanted to show you I'm using some squares today of two different colors. We'll be sewing them together. So quickly, I wanted to show you on every fabric there's a right side and there's a wrong side. And you can tell the difference because the right side is a little brighter. If you're working with solids, it usually doesn't matter if there's a right side or a wrong side, but take a look at yours and see if there is one side that you might like better than the other side. So when we're sewing our squares together, you want to do right sides together. So right side of one fabric sandwiched with the right side of the other fabric. And you put those together, and then we'll be sewing so that when the fabric's opened, you see both right sides. Now when you're quilting, you always use a 1/4 inch, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The seam allowance is the width from the edge of the fabric to where your stitching is. Once we get in front of our machine, I'll show you how to determine where your 1/4 inch is, but just be aware. So when we make other things, if you imagine making, say, a pillowcase, often you'll just simply put your needle at the top, start back stitching, and continue down. When you're quilting, you don't want to use any back stitching because it often adds a little bit of a lump at the top of your fabric. So this is where your chain stitching comes in. You always begin with scrap fabric. I have here, this is from another quilt that I made. You want 2 pieces of scrap fabric stacked on top of one another, and you'll begin quilting there. So you'll begin sewing. You'll add on all of your squares one by one. You'll just keep sewing, and then at the end you'll finish with another piece of scrap fabric. So let's go to the machine and see how that works. Okay, we're at our machine, so let's find our presser foot, our needle. Where your needle falls is typically right in the center of the presser foot. Some machines allow you to do another point. You can see mine move to the right. Some machines just have that center point. And then if you look, most machines offer you some kind of measurements here to tell you what your seam allowance is. If for some reason your machine doesn't do that, you can put your needle down and then you can use some kind of tape measure or your guide and find out where your 1/4 inch is. This is mine, and oftentimes I'll put a piece of colorful tape right here, like masking tape or washi tape, to mark where my 1/4 inch is. It's time to start sewing our squares. So you'll remember we begin with a piece of scrap fabric. So here's mine, and I simply put it directly under the presser foot, lower my presser foot, put my needle down, and I'll start sewing. It doesn't matter where in the middle of your scrap fabric you start. Once you've begun, so here's my first square. As you can see, it's right sides together. I'm going to line that up with my 1/4 inch line. You can see mine is right there. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and begin sewing straight from my scrap fabric onto my first one. And I've set my machine to slow stitch so that you can see what I'm doing here. You can see I've got my 1/4 inch lined up. My machine is sewing. All right, let's speed that up and finish up our square. Okay, now we've come to the end of our square. If you'll remember, we don't back stitch in quilting, so our next step is to add our very next square. So we'll butt that one right up against it, and we'll continue sewing straight from one square to the next square. Again, when we finish, we don't back stitch, we just add. I'm doing 3 squares today to show you. So here comes our 3rd square. At the end of that square, again, you'll want your piece of scrap fabric, so you'll just run that right in. Okay, once you're in the center of that scrap fabric, you can go ahead and cut your thread. My machine has a button up here that does it, but you could just do it manually, and then we'll lift this. And now if you'll notice, this is chain stitching. All of your fabrics are connected, and all of your squares are complete. So at this point, you'd want to go in and just clip the threads between each one, and you can see here you have your squares sewn together. So this is the method that you'll use for any sewing you do. You always in quilting want to start with a piece of scrap fabric and end with a piece of scrap fabric. This doesn't just apply to sewing 2 squares together. You could do your 4 squares together, however many you need, but you always want to start and end with those scrap fabrics for chain stitching.